Okay, I guess we can start. Welcome, everyone. This is one of the adaptation working group, guideline adaptation form and methodology sessions. This one will be dedicated to Rapidapt. We have with us Dr. Brian Alper. Brian is a board certified in family medicine and clinical informatics. He graduated from Heinemann University, now Drexel University School of Medicine, completed a fellowship at the University of Missouri, Columbia, and continued as a clinical research assistant professor, serving roles in research, clinical practice, and education at the University of Missouri, Columbia School of Medicine for 5 years. Brian founded Dynamed. I'm sure we all used or heard of Dynamed. It's an evidence-based clinical reference with a mission to provide the most useful information to healthcare professionals at the point of care. He also established a systematic literature surveillance as a method to extend the evidence-based medicine principles and sustain the continuous updating of Dynamed. Brian has advanced the methodology of evidence-based medicine through systems to support rapid development of high-quality guidelines with limited resources, modernized models for how to organize evidence and guidance for search for clinical use, and define certainty of net benefit as a focal point for what matters in healthcare decision. And currently in 2018, Brian started a scalable efforts to define the standard for computable expression for evidence and statistics with a project to extend fast healthcare interoperability resources for evidence-based medicine knowledge assets, which was called a EBM on FIRE. In 2020, to scale these efforts for immediate needs, Brian started the COVID-19 Knowledge Accelerator, changed his mission to enable standard-based medicine interpretable expression of knowledge, especially related to healthcare and scientific evidence. He founded the Computable Publishing LLC to fulfill his mission. He also created recently in 2021 the Fast Evidence Interoperability Platform, or FEVER, and founded the Scientific Knowledge Accelerator Foundation. Welcome, Brian, and welcome, everyone. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. And today we'll talk about the Rapadapt method, a method for guideline plus adaptation. We need to adapt from things more than just other guidelines, and that's you'll understand that as we go through the Rapadapt method. So for some disclosures, I'm the CEO of Computable Publishing and lead of many nonprofit, projects all related to making science computable. And I'm the lead author on the paper describing Rapidapt. So there's no financial disclosures related to the Rapidapt and what we'll talk about today. So Rapidapt started before it was Rapidapt with developments in 2010 and 2011. And Mario Tristan actually led a revised approach to guideline adaptation in Costa Rica and asked me, to help, and I gave him some support with that. He then asked me, could I help him with a presentation, because there was this conference it was going to be presented at, but the presentation needed to be in English. So could I help with that? And I said, okay. So I found myself going to this conference. It was the GIN conference in Berlin in 2012. And that was my introduction to the Guidelines International Network, just helping out with this presentation from what we've done. So it's fun to see the next set of slides are actually the original slides from 2012 that was presented at the GIN conference. And it was called Creating and Adapting a High-Quality National Clinical Guideline with Limited Resources. So the challenge was the Costa Rican health authorities wanted clinical guidelines for breast cancer treatment and for early detection, and they wanted it within 6 months. This was in June of 2010. So this was the original draft plan as written on the on paper, how they were going to plan to do the adapt method for these guidelines. And that was the first scratch paper. Then to use guideline adaptation method from Adapt, which has this summary for the Adapt process, was the first attempt. How do you assess the guidelines? How do you do external review? Were challenges to apply in this area. So they modified these part of the Adapt process, and they combined the guidelines and PubMed searches and clinicians, things you're all pretty familiar with. But what was new was being able to use resources like Dynamed and EBM guidelines that already do systematic literature surveillance evaluation of the evidence and get more evidence than can be found through what was already processed for prior guidelines. So the guidelines they ended up adapting from was the sign guideline and the a Catalonian guideline that was in Spanish. Dynamed, if you're not familiar with it, is a point of care clinical reference created by clinicians for clinicians. At the time, it had over 3,000 clinically organized topics. It's much larger today, but this was back in 2012. And it's an evidence-based approach. The systematic methods for systematic review were converted to systematic literature surveillance with 7-step methodology, summarized and synthesized from the best evidence and guidelines, and Dynamed is updated daily, so it's a lot more current than any other sources where you're searching. So Dynamed can be used rapidly because the data is presented in standardized templates with an outline format and have linking to the original articles for the data sources. And it can be available through the internet, mobile devices, and interactive forms through the internet. So this is a screenshot of Dynamed a decade ago, showing an example of a summary. This is particular article has a conclusion. It's level 2 evidence. It's based on a randomized trial. The reason for level 2 evidence is blinding was not stated. And then you have the details of what was done, what was found, and links to the original reference. So a lot of the evidence is captured in this form. And this was demonstrating a study reported in the British Medical Journal that looked at various sources of evidence, clinical evidence, Dynamed, EBM guidelines, e-medicine, and up-to-date. And they started with 128 systematic reviews. Half were Cochrane reviews, half were selected by McMaster as important, practice-changing reviews. And they followed every month and said, how many of the reviews have the results in these resources? And they reported that Dynamed was a lot faster than the others at getting them in, and most of the reviews were in Dynamed within 3 months of publication. I look at this and say, it's not just that it's faster. A year later, nearly all the reviews are in Dynamed, and half are not in the other resources. And we don't know if they ever get all the reviews in these other resources. So I think there's a comprehensiveness involved, not just a currency issue. So the guideline from the Catalonian guideline, the guideline summary in EBM guidelines in EBM guidelines, that's from Duodecim, the sign guideline, the evidence summaries on it from Dynamed, and some other cancer guidelines and staging information about cancer, and some original research trials. These are all the inputs that they wanted to evaluate. And there was the grade method for grading evidence. There was the sort method, which Dynamed used, 3 levels of evidence. Sign had another method. So they had put all these things together and want to get one simple guideline using the grade approach. So that was part of the goal in this guideline adaptation approach. So they then validated the recommendations by multidisciplinary experts, and they actually sought about 9-10 different disciplines and nearly a dozen experts by discipline for national level guideline panels, and then ultimately present the guideline in Spanish, and they make some derivative materials. I think this is showing the form that they asked the expert panel to review. Here's a draft recommendation statement, how it's phrased, and then rate on a scale of 1 to 9, extremely inappropriate to extremely appropriate. So if all of the guideline panel experts were to rate all of the recommendations as appropriate, then okay, we have a great agreement and we're done. If anybody rates it as inappropriate or middle ratings, then more discussions needed to figure out how to get the right recommendations. So that's part of the way they handled expert panel review and development. So this was the evidence body, the recommendation, and a Likert scale used for this rating. So the products that came out of this include a clinical practice guideline for breast cancer treatment with 90 graded recommendations. And they also made a version of the guideline for patients. So more plain language summary in Spanish, and a pocket version. So they also created many algorithms to fit with the flow of the guideline. So the results of this effort was 5 months to complete the training and the evidence analysis in the guideline preparation. It was the most current content of 16 clinical practice guidelines reviewed, and all studies on Medline and M-based search were captured by Dynamed on the path to this. And the clinicians involved at the beginning were considered resistors, resisting change when you try to introduce a new guideline, and they actually became supporters. The effort spent was the equivalent of 3 full-time equivalent personnel for 6 months, which is relatively minimal effort for a guideline of this size. So lessons learned through this process was the usefulness of adapting from other guidelines, not having to start from scratch, usefulness of Dynamed for finding current comprehensive appraised evidence to help with the effort. Efforts were needed to map the Dynamed level of evidence ratings to the grade methodology, and the usefulness of including the evidence in the stakeholder feedback. Prior to this in Costa Rica, guideline panels were not necessarily deeply discussing the evidence when discussing the guideline, and being able to provide the evidence in a good structured representation graded, that facilitated the guideline panel discussion. So this is what was presented at GIN in Berlin in 2012. And, Yasser was in the audience, and another participant, from Europe asked at the end of the presentation, do you have the protocol for this method in English? And Mario had it in Spanish, but did not have it in English. So I recruited a couple other people, Esther and Zibish, who you may know, and we collaborated with the Costa Rican guideline developers, basically to describe the protocol in English. But by the time we did all the work to describe it, and I think this took more work than the guideline development, or at least took a lot longer to get together and get accepted for peer-reviewed publication. Remember, the guideline was developed in a 6-month period. Sometime after 2012, we started to work on getting it in English. And in 2016, we have a publication now in the International Journal for Quality in Healthcare, Rapidapt for rapid guideline development. High quality clinical guidelines can be rapidly developed with limited resources. And you should have a copy of this in the GIN folder. And with this presentation, this link will take you to the full text of this article. If someone wants to share it in the chat, you're welcome to as well. So happy to answer any questions about it. And in the slides, I just have some of the key tables and images. The concept was, in addition to adapting from the guidelines, there are other sources to adapt from were evidence databases, Dynamed and EBM guidelines. So this table shows the use of all the foundational sources, the 2 guidelines and the 2 evidence databases for guideline development. So there were 90 recommendations. The SIGN guideline had adequate evidence in 72 recommendations to help with the new 90 recommendations, but did not have the details about the critical appraisal, or were not used in their approach for grading the evidence quality, because how to get from sign to grade and understand it would be a lot more challenging. The Guideline guidelines had 60 recommendations, enough for the evidence being found, but again, not used for the critical appraisal. Dynamed was felt to have 85 of the 90 recommendations had all the evidence, and for 5 additional searches were done to see if more evidence could be found. And EBM guidelines had 30 of the 90 recommendations as well. For grading, because EBM guidelines already used grade, for those 30 recommendations, they could just use the same grade ratings. And for 51 recommendations, they had the detail, like I showed you in that earlier image of Dynamed, blinding was not stated. They had enough information in the Dynamed summary to give the critical appraisal to determine the grade rating. And for 9 recommendations, they did a little more analysis to determine the grade rating. So we ended up making a simple mapping from Dynamed levels of evidence to the grade methodology. This mapping was not used during the actual effort, but it was derived from the learnings in this effort. Level 1 evidence is high quality evidence. And for this effort, they just confirmed it by methodologists as well, and basically confirmed anytime there was level 1 evidence in Dynamed, they came up with a high quality grade rating. Level 3 evidence is typically very low quality evidence if the reason for level 3 was no comparative evidence, case series, for example. But in Dynamed, another reason for level 3 evidence is if you have surrogate outcomes for making a decision for clinical care, that is automatically given the lowest level of evidence. And that essentially is indirectness. So if there's comparative evidence, but surrogate outcomes, then that turned into low quality evidence. And then level 2 evidence is either moderate or low, and depends on the type of study, randomized trial or not, and the type of number of limitations for it. I see there's a question in the chat. Thank you for showing the currency and comprehensiveness regarding Dynamed, UpToDate, and others in the 2011 publications. So one question is, does the issue still stand after more than a decade? And I cannot answer that with actual data and independent analysis, but I expect the issue does. And the reason for that is the specific methodology of Dynamed is to systematically monitor the evidence, capture it, and include it. And the other resources do not have a systematic literature surveillance methodology that governs making it happen. It's much more of the, get an expert author and they should know to cite the best stuff. And there's a lot of selection bias that occurs if the selection of evidence to include is not by protocol and systematic. So that's my suspicion, but it would take someone doing the work of that study to confirm that with data. And the second question says, many low to middle income country institutions subscribe just to one decision support tool. The person who wrote it says, my institution only subscribes to UpToDate, not Dynamed. Does the Rapidapt method work with UpToDate as well? And the answer is the Rapidapt method is saying adapt from evidence where someone else has already appraised it. So if you apply it to a resource that has a lower amount of evidence appraised, where you can find evidence appraised, then it still helps. You don't have to repeat that part, but you won't have as high a degree of certainty that you've captured as much of the evidence. So the method will still work. It's just a question of how much is there and how much you're comfortable missing or doing repeat searching. So if you don't have access to a more comprehensive effort, you can still use what you have access to and use what you can from it, and that'll save you some time compared to having to search for all the evidence and doing it from scratch. Just be aware, if the source isn't a comprehensive search, using it doesn't give you a comprehensive search. Okay, so table 3 are the 12 steps of the Rapidapt method. Identify and select your team, schedule your resources, common upfront planning. And then step number 2, train the team members as needed in the content domain and in the evidence-based methodology. Especially considering many of the concepts in today's approaches were involving patients and the public more in guideline development. So giving the people more understanding in the content domain. And to be fair, the patients and the public may be the best experts on what it means for them, what their life experiences are. Training the clinicians and what the patient's experiences are at the beginning may be useful as well. And then what was found in this experience was a number of the guideline panel members were not previously trained in evidence-based methodology, so training up front made the rest of the process smoother. Define the clinical questions, of course, to know what to focus on, and then identify candidate guidelines for adaptation. Step 5, another way of making this more efficient, is selecting the most useful guidelines with iterative evaluation until you find an adequate set of foundational guidelines. They use the agree to instrument to evaluate the guidelines, but if you have a large number of candidate guidelines and you're going to apply that to all guidelines, that could take a lot of time. So if you have ways to say, let's go until we have a good enough foundation, that can save some time. In this particular example, they made a selection criteria for a guideline about comprehensive scope. And there were many guidelines that were narrow in scope, didn't cover so many questions. And they found 2 guidelines that were very broad in scope, but and had good agree to ratings. But they were 3 to 4 years old, and that's why they needed additional evidence sources and did not want to repeat comprehensive evidence searching for 3 years across 90 breast cancer recommendations. So step 6 is identify existing summarized evidence for each question from the foundational guidelines and from clinical references with systematic evidence processes. Then you can limit your search in step 7 as a search for evidence for clinical questions where the summarized evidence is inconsistent or lacking. So that's adaptation, or you can adopt the evidence summary that they've used, you can adapt, or you can develop your own where it's lacking or you're getting different answers from different appraised sources. Then grade the quality of the body of evidence for each question. You might have to evaluate individual articles if there's inconsistencies, or if you just want to confirm high quality evidence, because just because someone else says it's high quality, you may or may not trust their judgment. Create draft of recommendations from all of this, including other aspects values, preferences, costs that may influence the recommendation. And then step 10, share the draft recommendations and the supporting evidence going along with it with the expert review panel using a process to identify convergence and divergence of opinion and interactive or iterative dialogue. And one of the things that was found to be very efficient in this example was the first round, you could say, if everybody agreed the draft recommendation was highly appropriate, you didn't need face-to-face meetings and further discussion, and you got the job done. But you do not want to have one strong voice influence everybody else as well. So this was done with anonymous electronic surveys to get that agreement ratings back. Then, if anybody disagreed and said, I don't think this is appropriate, it should be changed, then round 2 allowed the guideline developers to make modifications, understand what's happening, and then put it back out there with what the changes are and try that again. If you still did not get agreement after round 2, then this is the time where the face-to-face or interactive deliberation is really needed. And they did, in-person meetings for round 3. So then finally adjust recommendations as you get this feedback, and then external review, and then share, and then we're done. That's the 12 steps. Okay, so here's a flow chart showing what happened for these 12 steps in this particular example. So June 2010, the government asks for the guideline to be developed. A year later, the clinical guidelines department says, let's take a look at this task to take it on. And over a month or two, the new method idea is piloted with one question to see, how they could handle it with this approach. So then they really started July 24, pulling the team together and scheduling the resources to get the job done. And that's where we start step 1. Step 2, team member training, occurs in August, but it occurs again in November, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But the initial team member training was in August. Step 3, define the scope, was able to occur in August. Pick the guidelines, occurred in August. And then in September, start working through the evidence identification and processing. And because so much of the evidence was already prepackaged, that steps 6, 7, and 8 all occurred within September. So in October, draft the recommendations. And over the next few months, it goes through the expert panel review process. Round 1 and round 2 could be pretty efficient as discussed. And there was a subset of the recommendations that still had some issues after round 2, and a recognition that one of the disciplinary groups was not trained in evidence-based methodology. So they then set up team member training again for those groups, and then brought the panel back together for round 3, and then everything got universal anonymous agreement, and that finished it. So that's November, was able to get most of the ratings done, but then to train the group and continue takes us to January. So in January of 2012, it gets through the review and ultimately gets sent back to the government January 15, 2012. Then was evaluated and got good scores for the methodological quality of this guideline development, and was ultimately published October 2012. So the 4 major factors considered to have the greatest influence on accelerating guideline development, and this is in the article, this is straight out of the article, is number 1, training the guideline panel members in evidence-based medicine concepts and methodologies prior to having the detailed deliberations. Number two, using a satisficing approach, where you want to be as systematic as you can, but you want to be practical and efficient to quickly identify the adequate foundational guidelines for initial development instead of exhaustively evaluating all candidate guidelines. And, you know, if there's a very large number of candidate guidelines, that becomes more important. Using a current evidence database that is systematically identified, selected, and critically evaluated the most valid evidence for the relevant clinical questions, because of course the evidence evaluation is a lot of work, and if someone has already done that and you can adapt that, that will save you a lot of effort. And then number four, combining the evidence with the expert opinion and applicability. So all this information goes to the expert panel. Doing all this through expert panel ratings and dialogue with methodologies that quickly identified areas of agreement and facilitated dialogue with explanations for areas of disagreement. So if everyone agreed, the job is done and you move on quickly and don't spend a lot of time talking about what everyone agrees to anyway. And where there's disagreement, find ways to facilitate. We need greater understanding there and experience with this and with creating tens of thousands of recommendations in Dynamed. My experience is if you're doing this well, disagreements become agreements once you have adequate dialogue, explanations, and understanding. Because we're not really talking about, you know, political opinions or competing interests as much as just honest understanding of what the goals are and what we're finding. So specifically using electronic surveys in a structured, anonymized way helped identify and facilitate multi-person input and agreement, and avoid the large cost and effort of discussion sessions where not needed. And as I mentioned, avoided the potential over-influence of selected people, whether their style or reputation would lead them to basically set the answer for everybody else. So I'm happy to shift gears and talk about future directions, electronic approach to Rapidat perhaps, where we can think about getting structured data for applying the Rapidapt method, which would allow reuse of any of the content components. And for any component, you can accept it as is, which is adoption. You could modify it, which is adaptation, or you could replace it or create de novo, which would be development. And when I say any content component, that can include the evidence that is being used. Maybe you keep the same evidence, but you could change the risk of bias assessment of the evidence or the certainty of the evidence, the judgments of values and preferences, the evidence to decision judgments, the target population that's specified. And you might be changing any of these components when adapting a guideline recommendation. And I could show you some demonstrations about that. But before talking about future directions, I want to check and see if there's any questions about the Rapidapt method and the history of you know, what we've done and published for this method.
There's nothing new in the chat right now, but if anybody has a question, it's the good time to put it in the chat box. Or if you would like to unmute yourself and just ask, it will be fine too.
Mario is here now if you have any questions for him or if you'd like to include him in the discussion.
Yeah. So I thank Mario for sharing the slides from the 2012 presentation. It was fun to to reuse that, you know, from a decade ago.
No, Brian, it's a pleasure to recycle all this information which was very successful at that time and very useful.
Now we have some questions from El Haskell. Were there any copyright issues involved in using some of the guidelines? Actually, this is a famous cat challenge.
Right. Well, this was a particular development, so I think Sign probably doesn't have that, and I don't know about
Yes,
the catalog.
Sign are the best with
Yeah.
accepting, giving permissions. Yeah, for
Yeah.
adapting guidelines.
Mario, did you have copyright issues in the guideline sources in this?
Yes, the only thing you need to do is to ask permission for using the method, but it's open to everybody to use it. And if you need to contact us for any particular issue, we are open to do that. All the authors are here, and we have published several guidelines after that. The first one uses this method.
Yeah, if you went with some commercial guideline sources, you might run into things. I think the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, NCCN, they may have a different approach to guidelines than some of the others, and you might have to check with them. I'm guessing a lot of guideline developers, be happy, but
There's another one. There's another question from John. Are there any situations in which adaptation of a guideline might not be the ideal approach?
Right. So even on the screen, you see what might be called a development now, where you can adopt, adapt, or develop. If you have very, very few resources and you're not going to give much attention, you might find adopt more accepting. And if you find there's very limited reusable effort, the guideline doesn't match what you're looking for some reason, whether it's the quality or the scope of the questions asked or whatever it is, you may find that there's very little to adapt, and then you're going to be developing.
Right.
And if you find there's very little to adapt, then of course it wouldn't be ideal to adapt. But adaptation in general is a kind of reuse and adjust where needed. So it may just be semantics, whether if you're doing a development, right, where you do some adopt, some adapt, some development, that to me sounds like just another flavor of adaptation. And you're talking about question level, right, or component level. Do you adopt this piece or not? But the overall, do you take an adaptation approach? It probably comes down to, do you have enough material to be worth trying to adapt? If you found almost all of the material that you have, you change, then why are you adapting at some point?
We have another one from Yang. So what is the implementation or adherence of the Rapidapt guidelines that have used Rapidapt?
Well, I'm familiar with a Bahrain breast cancer guideline that used Rapidapt. And since there's no registration process to use it, I don't know if another group has used it or not. Mario, do you know of anybody else that has used the Rapidat method?
Yes, the Pan American Health Organization used the Rapidat method for Honduras diabetes clinical guidelines, and they are using it still. That's the valid clinical guidelines for diabetes in Honduras. I'm not sure how they are using it, but the details of the clinical guideline use, but it has been useful and efficient for them. That's the only thing I can tell you about that.
Actually, Brian, I think Jan meant implementing the guideline itself rather than using a Rapidapt. I mean, it's already a Rapidapt guideline. So, are there any implementation reports or adherence reports for?
Not so far in my site.
Okay, we have another question. Thank you for about poor resources. How many guidelines developers were involved in the guideline development?
In the Rapidapt development or in the guideline development using the Rapidapt method?
Yeah, in the Rapidapt process. I mean, developing guidelines using Rapidapt.
So in the development of Rapidapt, you mean?
Yes, during the development process. I think this is a question.
So we had the original guideline developers, Mario and his team, and then I was involved, which represents recommendations in Dynamed is like a guideline, and then Esther and Zibish were other guideline developers brought in to help. So so 4 different institutions, if you will. In basically interpreting the experience that occurred in Costa Rica and deriving the Rapidapt method, from this retrospective case evaluation. So that was the multiple guideline developer involvement in the Rapidapt, method. It wasn't like a Delphi survey or something like that, a consensus method itself in the development. It was a retrospective evaluation of a unique case where there was an extremely efficient development of a high quality, high volume evidence-based guideline.
Okay, thank you. Another question, I think this will be answered in the next slides. Do you think structured or computer interpretable guidelines will enhance adaptation or adoption? I think this will come next, right?
Yes, I think so, because if we can break down what we need to do and make it easier to capture any component and act on it, a computer can help us a lot with all the tasks that are not really cognitive tasks, keeping track of bits of information, resetting and saving in another spot, things like that. So I can't show you a mature tool to apply an adaptation method, but I can show you some tools we're building on the way there. So we're going to follow this link to fevir.net. And that is the Fever platform, Fast Evidence Interoperability Resources. And it's free to use. You can go to fevir.net, and there's all kinds of projects and developments occurring here. And something that we just released yesterday is the Magic to Fever converter. Select a magic file. Right now, it's just a demo to automatically create fire resources. And hold on one second. I'll be right back. Hey, I need about.
I put the link of Fever on the chat if you want to copy it.
So I've got some people working at the house here, unfortunately, and I may have to pay a little bit of attention. But we're going to go to the Magic to Fever converter. Magic you may be familiar with as a source for guideline development. We're going to put in a demo, pick one of the files, and convert the Magic to Fever. All of the data is in structured form in Magic, and we have created a recommendation of it, 10 outcome definitions for the outcomes in this evidence, and 20 evidence bits for the different outcomes, and then a justification for the recommendation. If we look at the justification for the recommendation, you'll see we captured the title, the link to the recommendation itself, the summary, we suggest starting GLP-1 receptor agonist, the strength of recommendation, the evidence, the summary statement, and the certainty of evidence rating. I'll show you the evidence in more detail in a moment. And then for the justification, we captured the rationale, the benefits and harms that got a strong rating, preferences got a weak rating, resources and cost was coded as not considered, and other considerations they called advice and remarks. So this is all structured data from that recommendation in MAGIC, and we actually have it in highly structured coded form if we look at the metadata. So you could see that we can capture the bits in very small units, and you can imagine you can decide whether to accept, change, or replace any single bit, and that can make the whole process of guideline adaptation more efficient. With all this evidence in structured form, I can show you what a piece of evidence looks like. You know, we have the summary here, the population, adults with diabetes, the exposure, standard care. This is just the control group, all-cause mortality. The statistic is a proportion. If we look at the comparative evidence, we have the same population, the exposure is the drug, the control, standard care, the outcome is the same. And now you see a risk difference, confidence intervals, odds ratios, certainty ratings. But with all that structured evidence, we could generate an evidence report, and I'll pick the outcome definitions, some of the evidence, and the summary of findings constructor. And this will generate from the structured data a summary of findings report. So we're going to continue to develop the tooling to do things like this. But as that develops, you can imagine how every step of guideline adaptation could be supported with electronic resources to facilitate the reuse of all of this data.
Yes, this tool that you are showing now will be ideal for us when we were working on this, on the first guidance, adaptation on the first guidance on breast cancer. This is a wonderful tool to compare results of what we have and what is the original guideline is showing compared to the new evidence update, which is one of the most important issues you have to be considering. Thank you, Brian. That's wonderful.
All right. See in the chat, there's one comment about an issue with the sign-in on the Fever platform. You know, if you log out, you can click sign in, create account, and it should use the Google approach to, you know, I'm just doing that automatically. If you may have to look in a new window if there's another tab or window where you have to sign into your Google account. You can try also what's called an incognito window if that needs help, but you do need a Google account. We don't keep names and passwords and so on. We just let you use the Google account to sign in. To generate content, you need to sign in to use some of the tools. To view content that you're not creating something new, you don't have to sign in. But I think to see the MAGIC to Fever converter, you're generating content. You're generating new reports, so you will have to sign in for that. I see Lubna asks, as more and more adaptation models are coming up with many similarities, what is the hallmark of Rapidapt? I think the major hallmark is the adaptation of pre-appraised evidence databases and not just the adaptation of guidelines. The methods for facilitating consensus in efficient ways might be another hallmark of Rapidapt. See, Moray says in the adapt methods, there's less detail about the actual adaptation of existing recommendations once you've carried out the quality assessment of the source material. Could you explain how the methodology supports developers to appropriately revise the wording of the recommendations other than confirming agreement? Are there limits to the degree to which panels are free to revise the recommendations as they choose? So one of the concepts, when you do have structured data for every component, the rationale, the benefits and harms, the wording, you could apply a component level adaptation and let a guideline panel agree or disagree. Do we like the rationale or do we want to modify that? And that will facilitate that in the future. As to, are there limits to how much the panels could revise? That depends on the methods you set up for your particular panels and how they work. There's no external rules that determine how much you can adjust when you're creating your guideline. So you put that into your methodology. But I think limiting because of prior methods, only looking at the evidence and saying yes, no, is a bit limiting. So I think in the future, as we can capture data for every component of guideline panel judgments and guideline development, we can support the adaptation approach to any component of guideline development.
Sorry, we missed a question from Janice. Would you consider expert opinion to include public patient involvement as well as clinician, researcher, methodologist expert opinion?
Personally, I think so. I think the patients are expert in what it feels like to be a patient and what it means to them. It's just expertise in a different aspect of the whole process.
Well, another one from Haskell. Have you considered using the National Academy of Medicine, formerly IOM, standards for trustworthy guidelines to rate candidate guidelines for adaptation?
Yeah, I think they're good standards for what makes it trustworthy. I'm not familiar with if they are in the form of a rating assessment, like the agree to tool, is a method for rating, right? As opposed to the guidance for what should be done versus the rating for how well was it done.
Yes. One thing that we have to consider is that we have to use a standard method for selecting the guideline you are going to adopt. So in this case, you can use any of the tools to, first of all, verify that your personal question when you are for the clinical guideline you are preparing are included in the guideline. And secondly, you have to evaluate or assess the quality of the clinical guidelines using any of the valid methods proposed by agree. That's the first step you have to be aware. That's what we use that. We need to know that the clinical guidelines we are adapted is in according it follows the method we are using to build up clinical guidelines.
Do want to mention the effort behind what you see on the Fever platform. There's a group called the COVID Knowledge Accelerator. It's an open group to advance these standards and tools and systems. And there's a weekly meeting schedule, Eastern time zone. So on Thursday mornings, Eastern, we have an evidence-based medicine on fire implementation guide working group, followed by a computable evidence-based medicine tools development working group. And that is where some of the developments of what you've just seen is occurring. Also on Wednesday mornings, there's a knowledge ecosystem liaison working group to help coordinate how we work with other groups developing in this area. So these are all open meetings in the same Microsoft Teams meeting room, and you're welcome to join any of these that would interest you. If you're interested in the helping with some of the technical developments or technical specification developments to support, you know, the future electronic adaptation methods. And I can put this link in the chat. So if anybody wants to participate beyond, you know, just learning about it at you know, at this session.
I think we have another question. Are there any specific study designs that lend themselves more to adaptation?
Well, typically when we're talking about adaptation, we're talking about adapting the summary of the evidence and ratings of the evidence and the judgments about it. So if you're very familiar with judgments about randomized trials, you may be more comfortable adapting, you know, from others that have judged randomized trials. If people have judged complex study designs that you're not as familiar with, you may struggle with, can we accept it? Do we adjust from it or not? But the methods of adaptation are often not at the level of the risk of bias assessments. Now, at some point when we get more granular and you can decide, do you accept the risk of bias assessment of the original research, right? Which almost might be more like a systematic review adaptation than a guideline adaptation. Then you might say, which types of studies being assessed are you comfortable adapting from? And I can imagine at some point in the future, just like there's a large amount of duplication in guideline development, so you have adaptation methods, there's a large amount of duplication in systematic review development. And if systematic reviewers can apply adaptation methods and incrementally improve systematic reviews without having to repeat all the searches and all the critical appraisal that other systematic reviewers have done, then we may see another major efficiency gain in the overall adaptation approach for the evidence ecosystem. So Janice asked, can the Rapidapt tool be used for living guidelines also? And I think so. Living guidelines, living evidence, this just gives tools that will make it more efficient to keep processing it, you know, in real time.
Can I ask as well?
Yes, what?
Yeah, I was wondering, would you classify Rapidapt as one? Because we have noticed that most of the formal adaptation methodologies either will follow the adapt approach or modification of it, or the grade approach, or both of them. So if you would classify Rapidapt, you would put them under which category? I mean, like adapt-based or grade-based, or both, mixture of both?
It's a mixture of both. It was derived from adapt, and then it specifically includes grade as the method of you know, grading the evidence and strength of recommendation. So I'm not sure what the distinction is when you say one versus the other, because I think of grade as more about the grading of the quality and certainty of concepts, and adapt as more about a framework of how to work through the process. So adapt can use grade as the grading method, as opposed to a grade method for the process of guideline adaptation.
Yeah. And another thing, having an increasing number of published systematic review of guidelines with agree appraisals Do you think the Rapidapt can make use of such published appraisals of guidelines at the level of the guidelines, not that the evidence?
It could, because one of the steps of Rapidapt, if we have to pick, identify candidates for adaptation, and then select the most useful guidelines for adaptation. And one of the methods of evaluating the guidelines is the agree appraisal. If someone has already appraised the guideline, then you can adapt their appraisal of the guideline, which is a part of the Adapt method or Rapadapt method, and you're just applying it to a different component. So you can reuse if someone has already assessed what are the quality guidelines, that quality guideline matches your area, you don't have to reassess. So if somebody made a guideline registry that included quality assessment of all the guidelines, that could even be another facilitator of guideline adaptation if you can pre-select, quality guidelines to adapt from.
And also as far as fever, I think we talked about this before. Do you think that these published systematic review of guidelines could be a useful component of fever? I mean, they can be built in or incorporated in fever and used later on.
What could be, I mean, if we go back to fever, there's a lot of things occurring on fever. You can convert Medline articles to citations on fever. You can convert clinicaltrials.gov data to that. You can create your own content. You'll see there's a lot of projects on here. So one of the projects, we have Research on Fire, where we have taken a systematic review of tools using Fire for research, and we're going through the items that's in the review, making links for things found in it, making citations for every item that we're evaluating. And then as we evaluate it, here's the reference list, and the description of that citation is like an annotated bibliography. So you can use the platform in different ways. So if you're conducting a systematic review, you can put the publications on the Fever platform, and we have done that to some degree in developing the Fever platform. Is we started to do a systematic review and put things on here. We have also developed things, and I'm gonna, I'll fill this out just to show it because I think we're out of time, but we have a risk of bias assessment tool, and I'm gonna, act like I'm making a risk of bias assessment of this paper. It's not appropriate, but I'm gonna pick the ROB2 tool. Let's assume this is a randomized trial, and I'm gonna make this a demo, not real risk of bias assessment of this thing, because the actual content doesn't make sense for it. But I can say, I think there was inadequate allocation concealment, and that maybe favors things. So I'm going to give that a moderate risk of bias. And I think there's a confounding difference likely, it's some moderate risk of bias. And I can fill in more and more of these pieces, maybe ultimately summarizing the highest level of bias as favoring something. And I could, say why as my rationale, add any number of notes and so on. Go ahead and update all of that. And I'll have my risk of bias assessment. And for all the different types of bias, I could fill in. I only filled in a couple here. But, so using a tool to document your risk of bias assessment as you go through the systematic review development, using it to capture the data. You saw we captured evidence and generated a summary of findings, capture the original evidence reports and generate the meta-analysis result, things like that. We're developing various aspects for many different components, from the creation of evidence to the systematic review to the guideline development. So each of the tools is at different stages, and we're really it's a platform not to be the tool, but to support many other tool developers in exchange of data. So if you like to use Magic or GradePro or Covidence or some other tool, but you also want to use Medline or check the data in clinicaltrials.gov, we want to facilitate being able to work in digital sharing across all of the many tools.
We have another question about how to search in Fever database. If we're searching for a specific clinical condition like headache, neck pain, for example.
That really does not apply because we're setting up a platform to facilitate data exchange across tools that do these things. And although you could create a repository and put the data on the platform, we are not actually have a real repository of data. So there's nothing to search right now. And we haven't built the search tool in because we haven't built the method for searching. We have developed a demo prototype of a knowledge portal. And this demonstrates being able to search for things of type guidance or evidence or quality improvement. And then we can, pick something to narrow the search and see different things that occur according to this. But this is more demonstration of how you could set up a repository and a portal for searching. And we don't have an actual scaled set of data. So there's nothing to search on the Fever platform right now, for that type of question.
But is this planned in like a future function of Fever, or it's out of the scope?
It depends on the desires of the community, right? If there are folks in the community that need it as a direct function and support it, we can build that in. And if the community is mainly going to use other tools, and the main function of Fever is to facilitate data exchange between other tools, then develop in that direction. So it depends where interests and resources get applied. So our primary goal is to make science computable and facilitate electronic data exchange of all this type of information. So we end up building tools to make it easier to do, but we don't know yet. Ultimately, if we support the behind the scenes platform for other tool developers, or if we end up developing the tools that people use, it'll probably be some kind of a hybrid, depending on what groups need and where they put their resources. So it we openly collaborate with many, and it's amount of activity and resources that drives the priorities and the agendas for what gets developed.
I think we're running out of time. Any last questions from the audience? I think, Janice, it's not if a project about subject matter is developed with citations and more than you can advance the evidence, have a systematic review, recommendation summary, and more. I think this is a comment, not a question, right?
Yeah, I think Janice has developed some projects on the Fever platform, so she's commenting on some of the other features. We could do another session to get into the many features. I just showed specific things that would relate to guideline adaptation. But we've actually done research on the Fever platform and had informed consent and done questionnaires all on the platform. So it's really a broad supportive scientific knowledge exchange, and not just the guideline adaptation, but we could set up another time if there's a desire, focused attention on those things.
Okay. Any more questions before we close the session? I guess there's no more questions. So Okay, if there is no more questions, we would like to thank everyone for joining, and thank you, Brian, for this outstanding presentation. Very interesting and exciting, especially the fever initiative. We need to know more about it in later sessions.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and goodbye. We're looking forward to seeing you in the next session of the formal adaptation methodologies. The next one will be about the magic framework or the magic app and all of its functions.